Tell us a little bit about who you are.
Before my name was spelled with a C, it almost got spelled with a K, because my father had named me after somebody I did not know or was revealed to me for a long time, Karl Marx. And of course, as most people know, Karl Marx was part of a whole thinking about the manifesto of the fixicities and the predictabilities of the rules of life. That was his whole understanding, is that you could take a concept like communism or a certain kind of economic thinking and predict how society would unfold, how culture would take place, etc. So to be named after that person and not know it was a bit of an ambush.
An ambush.
It was a bit of an ambush.
Wow, that's quite a story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And when you think about your clinical trajectory,
Mm-hmm.
what comes to mind? How would you describe what you've been through as someone who tries to help people that are suffering?
Well, the clinical or the professional aspect to this inquiry
Well, have a stab at both, yeah?
Combines two things. My deep and early understanding that the human being is frail as well as possible, vulnerable as well as protected, very, very curious as well as numb. I seem to know all the time that we oscillate between these extremes. Numb could be the defenses, vulnerable could be the excitements. A lot of exchange, a lot of substitution that can go on in these understandings. So that's always been with me.
So that's been a way of orienting.
It's a way of orienting, it's a way of conjuring, it's a way of discerning, evaluating. It's with me all the time. In fact, as we've talked before, it's a way of feeling life as literature. And as potentially literature is bigger than life, once a person finds their literary agent, once they find their own character, once they find their own plot line, once they do their own road work to get to these different places in their story.
So by literature, you mean crafting our own narratives?
The narrative handed to us, the narratives taught to us, the narratives we create from all that, it's ongoing. It feels perpetual.
What else comes to mind when you think of the word literature? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's, as you know, dimensions of literature, forms of literature, certain periods of time of literature. But basically, it's knowing the story we want. For instance, in terms of clinical work, it's the difference between the literature that we're born into, the literature we become aware of, the literature we reach for to create, the literature that we edit and become, the literature we present and advertise. All of its literature, all of its story, all of its some kind of narration that has relevance.
Wow, so those are the waters you swim in.
Yeah.
Okay, wow. So when you think back, tell me a little something about what stands out as maybe one or two of the more poignant, meaningful experiences you've had trying to help another person. Yeah.
I'll give you an interesting anecdote because it just happened. This is a younger client, met him in the place that I do a lot of work in now, which is more of a 12-step rehab center. This client came in with mental health diagnosis. And so I'm asking the question about this diagnosis. It's given to me, and some of the background is given to me. And typically, I listen really carefully. And I'm listening for sequence, I'm listening for symbology, I'm listening for the story, I'm listening for contradiction and paradox. Because language, being the upper skin of how we represent ourselves, is loaded. It's full of little gold mines of possibilities. This person tells me, because we're having lunch, that he's asking me if I remember the initial meeting, and I said, sort of. So he clarified that after he gave me the whole story, and I asked him his diagnosis, and he told it to me, and then I thought for a minute, and I said, I wonder if that's the right diagnosis. It seems to me that the right diagnosis might be excess self-pity. And he said he sat there slightly stunned and slightly offended, and thought about it, and then turned to me and said, I think you're right. And that person said, from that moment on, he came out of, felt like he had been emerging from, freed from the diagnostic tyrannies that go on with so much naming.
Wow, wow.
That just happened about a week ago.
What gave you the confidence? I'm assuming you had some sense that there was rapport, that this comment would land in an okay manner. What gave you that confidence or
The
insight?
confidence really comes out of history, and being who we are, being comfortable who we are, identified who we are, doing our own work, so we can represent some authenticity and integrity about who we are. That's one. Two, the setting. The setting is a therapeutic setting, and to me, there's an assumption that searching and inquiry is a natural part of what's in that setting, or in an office. And sometimes even a kind of a meeting on the street, because inquiry and curiosity to me suggests, permits questioning, slight provocations, slight elbowing or a slight nudging towards something other than what's being spoken.
Slight elbowing.
Yeah.
A bit of a ribbing there.
Yeah, a little bit of ribbing. Yeah. And it's a younger person, and this is a person that had some real educational background. This is a person that was clearly smart and clearly could pick up quickly and move language around. That gave me some confidence. The look between us, the kind of pleasure we were having sitting at that table, gave me a little bit of confidence.
You saw a twinkle in his eye.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And mine. I could feel my twinkle.
And so where did it go from there? What happened next?
Well, what he said was, from that point on, he just felt like he was in the right place. He felt like he was in the right place at the wrong time, meaning he needed to be where he was. A lot of therapy, a lot of groups, a lot of handouts, a lot of naming, a lot of identifying. But that now he had a bus ticket out that he hadn't had before we sat down.
You must have thought you died and went to heaven. That's the kind of client you like.
I do love that kind of client.
Yeah.
And my dad, being a Marxist, didn't believe in heaven, so I don't get the benefit.
Okay. So when he had that awareness that he was suffering from self-pity,
Yes.
was the awareness alone enough to dislodge the problem, the self-pity?
That's a great question. I think what it sets up over and over and over, if it happens that way, which it does quite a bit, is that once a person, including me, including my friends, including clients, realize that there's a natural deception in believing in a category, a natural fake in believing in a certain noun instead of its verb or its adjective, which moves very differently. If I say I'm depressed, it's different than if I'm saying I'm depressing, which suggests it's got a beginning and an end. And it's a verb. So I think once that happens, and it happened with him, he was able to, and pretty quickly, kind of assemble his own history, his own causality, his own way of looking at the things that he felt afflicted him differently. And I think what starts to happen pretty quickly is the person's own natural willingness and wantingness, desirousness to be other than they are, not only just escaping or leaving, this sort of suffering of conditions, but being this better self, this higher self. It's built into the model. The 12 steps. Be other than, be this more integrous, be this more permitted, be this more, participatory person was starting to happen quickly. And that's what I think happens. And so then, if I want to do a little bit of neuroscience and explain the ongoing challenge of getting the better hold of the way our minds work based on brain structure, it goes really well.
So you tap into the inherent desire within the person to be the best version of themselves.
Or at least another version.
Yes,
first.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you mentioned the 12-step model. Does that mean that you adhere to some of those principles?
Well, I love what it says. I love how it instructs.
Mm.
It's like coming across a new game, but you got instructions. So what about this? And did you ever think of, so that's pretty good. It's like a little miniature Bible about right conduct. It's Buddhist that way. It's talking about right
Right.
behavior,
But given your move away from reification and labels, how does it sit with you that in that model you're supposed to own that you're an addict and helpless? And
that
so
part
on?
doesn't sit. That part I want to spank and chase away.
Yeah. Okay. So you pick and
But
choose.
but they're fine. People are fine. Most of the people I meet don't live inside those paragraphs. And in fact, it's pretty fertile to look at any of those steps and poke around a bit and see what was missed. Which is a great way to look at therapy, in my view. What was missed? What story didn't we see we were living under? Who even whispered that story to us or shouted it at us that we weren't even aware was doing that? I just talked to a person the other day who said exactly that. I grew up thinking this was just the way it was because it was. And I was going, wow, that's nothing that I understand. That it just is because it is. Because somebody said so.
The absence of questioning.
Yeah. Or even the feeling of your own agency. Yeah, I was like, wow. And the person just, I questioned him right there. Are you sure? Did you not? I mean, when you're getting beat up by somebody, did it not dawn on you that something was like malaligned here?
I'm thinking about Milton Erickson. A lot of what you say harkens him to my mind. Any relationship to him?
Very much. Because when I came out from LA to leave the law, I've been practicing law for a while, and then study consciousness and Buddhism and apply it in an actual setting that was already operating. Milton Erickson, and the Erickson, the whole culture of Ericksonianism, was right there in Phoenix, where I live. And so to go down and look at and read those books and study those tapes and be part of those conferences, delicious.
If you had to pick one or two things from Milton Erickson's way of being and thinking that stands out the most, that has had the biggest impact on you, what would that be?
Well, it's the word they use. It's called utilization. And I love that word. Essentially, it implies there's no wastage. There's no trash. There's no regrets, theoretically, because that means everything that occurs, everything that appears, all appearances are useful. All emotions can be creative. All directions, all wishes and dreams, from fantasy to imagination, one being kind of ego-centered, one being kind of more creative-centered, are all useful. It becomes our task to employ ourselves, meet the people, the others, in our lives nearby or that we look for. The search can help shape and sculpt those ingredients. That's exactly what that gave me early.
What has it meant to you to be able to do this and help people in this way?
I always cast myself as one of the world's most safe, most collaborative, most experienced voyeurs. Because there's so much I haven't done, and yet I have a bunch of kids that feel family to me. There's so much I haven't experienced, but it seems like there's so much I understand because I take the time to be as present as I can with experiences I've never traversed. And it seems like I look forward. I anticipate even more. Even altered state of consciousnesses to me, when I'm in them, seem like not me. Somebody would say I might have a profound dissociative complex. I say it's creative because I don't always have to taste the elixir. I don't always have to taste the nectar to know its value. I don't always have to go on a payment plan for something.
So in a sense, you have developed an ability to live vicariously in a way that's quite magnified.
Yeah, the word vicarious has a cultural implication that kind of smells of phony.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a great term for what I'm describing.
That's a better one.
But the witness, the observer, the participant by way other than territory and ownership still allows this really deep connection to what's going on right near me. And sometimes within me. Sometimes when I have a feeling of, damn, I never knew that, still feels like I'm beginning to know it in the moment that occurs.
So how do you navigate between the mode of witnessing and observing and the realm of acting and intervening and interjecting yourself? How do you
being
navigate?
active, yeah.
Yeah.
I think by paying a lot of attention to the implicit. Carl Bohm called it the implicate order. The implicit to me is so rich, it's so orchestral, it's so compositional. There seems to be so much room. Like this office is lovely for space, but in the way I'm referring to space, there's kind of no walls. Really, there doesn't have to be a fireplace, because you and I could imagine something at the hearth. You and I could imagine warmth. You and I could remember times of sitting at a fireplace, which means memory itself can help generate change just by utilizing memory.
Utilization of memory and fantasy.
And imagination, yes.
Right.
Yes. Utilization, meaning nothing's, I'm repeating myself a little, nothing's wastage. That means there's no real necessity for regret. It might mean, like this young client said, that too much regret could lead to self-pity, which kind of suggests a paralysis that's unnecessary. You actually don't have a missing limb. You actually have the limb you sort of thought might be missing, you felt was absent.
Now, Carl, when you think about the therapy culture in general, if memory serves, you have a critique or two. Tell us.
3 or 4.
Right. Tell us a little bit about what stands out in terms of the therapy culture in general that you're not particularly wild about.
Well, 2 things that really stand out. 3 things, really. And the 3 things, if we say call them things, are really 3 aspects of the human experience. And I go back to the dialectic because I like it. It's the triangle. It's this ray of understanding how things take place, how their opposite also is taking place at the same time, yin and yang. And the resultant of those 2 is an ongoing, perpetual, unfolding, emerging truth. Now, once I felt and knew that, once I kind of studied that a little bit, really believed it, and once I saw through some of this early training that it was actually the case, that meant for me that most bifurcated models, Gestalt, for example, to sit in 2 chairs, there's an overdog and an underdog, I'm just taking one example, was incomplete. So you have 2 dimensions, missing 1, which is the resultant of the 2. So in that particular model of having somebody go back and forth between 2, quote, oppositional places internally, is missing what takes place with the space between them. That seems absolutely consistent and lovely from this early looking at Ericksonian principles of utilization.
So it sounds like one of the main issues you have is the implicit hierarchical structure that is often there in the therapeutic dyad.
Yes.
Okay, so the hierarchy of it.
And the professional assumptions by the model being investigated. Whether it's Jungianism or Freudianism or behaviorism, spiritualism, it wouldn't matter. It might be lacking understanding the space between the 2 places that it presents.
But not attending to that lends itself to this hierarchical structure.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right.
And then you like labels and diagnoses.
As you so smilingly ask me. No, I hate labels, other than what I call, quote unquote, let's defeat the diagnosis by either coming up with a more supple diagnosis or defeat it entirely. And that just means picking at the carcass of the language of the diagnosis until you can see it's already been covered before anybody told you that. You already knew that before you were told.
And an example of a more supple diagnosis would be you suffer from self-pity, for example.
That's a different diagnosis, which suggests attitude, not condition. Now, attitude in a way is condition, but it's my condition. I've created it. I find the motive to inhabit it. I portray it, and so forth.
So we have the culture of hierarchy, not attending to the in-between, right? We have labels and diagnoses. Anything else come to mind when you think about therapy culture that you don't like?
Yes, absolutely. The narrative therapy model suggested by White years ago, I thought was not only brilliant in its application, but brilliant in its humility. Because in that model, a group of people can be sitting around with quote unquote a client, but the main rule is there's no therapist. They're participants. I love that. And that means technically that anybody in that group should expect to participate in a way where, but for the grace of God, there go they, which means they're already part of anger, or part of confusion, or part of anxiousness, or part of regret. Everybody's participating in their own literature, with the central theme being that which is chosen to be there. I love that model.
Yeah. It reminds me of Frida from Reichman, who said that there are no categorical differences between us and the clients. The word trauma, free associate.
This I've given a lot of time to. And if somebody feels or announces they have trauma, if somebody feels or announces they've got PTSD, one of the first things I might say is, let's suspend that just for a moment. Before you order the burger, let's look at the ingredients one more time. Let's look at the options. Let's look at the side dish. Fries well done? Let's kind of think it out a little bit. And they usually suspend judgment for a bit. And then we poke around and look a little more closely. Because all I'm really doing is asking, like a car coming into an auto shop, what are the symptoms? What do you notice when you drive? What do you notice when you turn? What do you notice when you put the brakes on? What do you notice when you even get in the vehicle in the first place? Which now is the relationship between the vehicle and the person who owns the car. I do it that way, and then I might say, maybe what we're talking about here is the notion of stuck time. Maybe what you're referring and describing is time is standing still in the regards that you're instructing me about that theme, that topic, that dimension, that part of life. So stuck time, the stagnant waters of time, seems to be a handy metaphor for people to come more into, well, how do I step back in the stream? How do I move the rocks out of the way? If I stub my toe, how do I stop being angry about it and come back into the river that has rocks, and once in a while those rocks will create some pain on a foot that walks it.
So in one form or another, the therapeutic task that you tend to engage will involve a move away from labels, reifications, the tyranny of narratives, expectations.
And move much more elegantly towards experiences, descriptions, possibility, lost reflections, meaning reflections that could have been but weren't. So it's kind of a reclaiming of missing pieces without so much need to tragedize the pieces that are missing.
Okay. And I'm assuming you end up with a kind of perceptual flexibility.
Yes.
Say a
I
little
love that word, as you know.
We'll say more about perceptual flexibility.
Sure. In my use of trauma techniques, quote unquote, I'll typically interview somebody in 3 sets of time. The before, the during the trauma, and the anticipated and imagined next when trauma is more cleared up or understood. I'll typically interview a person very carefully about those feelings, those somatic senses, those images, so it's clear that there was a before, there was a during, and now there might be an after as we sculpt a new story. And once that goes on, and they've investigated it with me and I've investigated it with them, I'll simply say, you might not know this, but the acting technique, method acting, introduced by Stanislavski, Russian from years ago, requires a great actor to know the great parts of their story, to let them be mobile to the moment in time where they can step in and out of their own reality. And that becomes creative, not disassociative. They can reach back and become, they can reach forward and imagine, they can be right here in the now and kind of discern. They can do all 3. And it takes a little time. It feels very musical, compositional. It feels like you're beginning to edit and add to the novel you're writing.
What piece of literature do you think captures some of these insights and understandings that you refer to the best?
Literature itself.
Yeah, actual pieces of literature.
You know, one thing that's interesting, I was thinking about that the other day. Flaubert is a French writer. And when you look at his writing, it's long. We're talking a lot of writing. But the way that mind of his, or him himself, or both, moves in and out of the kaleidoscopic nature of a moment, of an anticipation, like I mentioned, or a memory, or a thingness. It's almost like all time, all moments and events in time, have these dimensions going simultaneously. And so his use of language on the page allows him to come and go, and just keep coming and going. So there's a funny evasiveness, there's a funny lack of commitment, but in the lack of commitment that we sometimes feel is such a pathology, there's a fluidity. In this lack of feeling not docile to a moment, but curious in a moment, and its counterpart, there's a movement and a creative and a kind of a cinematic quality to what he's living or describing on the page. So I like that for that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating how that mind does that. Extremely fluid.
Wow. And any other pieces of literature?
Oh, there's so much literature. Sure, I mean, we're working in the American culture. This is the American mythology. This is the mythology, all the little sayings we have, you know. I brought some actually, they're sitting in the vehicle. But all our mythology here, our folk tales here, the tales of the frontier, the rugged individualism, the army poster, be all you can be. There's always kind of a veneer here that if you're not all you can be, there's something wrong. Always. And it's actually fiction. Most of that is fiction. But it does keep people reaching, but I must admit it also keeps people kind of disappointed in themselves. There's always some kind of a disquiet that people have about the lives they're living. It's never quite enough. I mean, look at the whole culture of addictions and compulsions, compelling behavior. Look at this culture of litigation, laws, codes, punishments, consequences, the whole system. So that's what I notice is going on all the time. Sometimes I'll attempt to bring a little of that to somebody. They're in the river, they're in their rowboat, but I'm just kind of with them, saying, look that side of the rowboat, what about overhead? Can you feel the oar in your hand? Can you feel the current that holds the boat back? Yeah, there's a lot of that.
I notice you use a lot of visual imagery, vivid visual imagery in your language. Is there any thinking behind that?
Well, the visual or the auditory or the felt sense, the embodied sense of an experience, to me, is the fullness. And if somebody can be more and more full, more and more participating, to me, I have an assumption that the fuller and the most that they are, without judgment, begins to free them from the necessity of reliving that experience, if they choose to. That to me is where choice operates. Not just intention, but actual resource that translates to choice.
Is that because the experience has been sufficiently metabolized?
It's metabolized, been looked into, it's gone on to its own, you've got beautiful art here, it's gone on to their own gallery, their own office of their own life, the work they do, as well as the people that they are with, are doing. I mean, this office, this space is so gorgeous, is quite the metaphor, and you said it earlier. Everything in here is mine, is what you said. Well, I want, if I can, get people to realize and understand, this is landmark a little bit, that everything internal is theirs. And if they feel it's not, we'll find a way to either own it, lease it, rent it, or extricate it. But at least for a while, they have the rights to it. Ancient rights.
One more time where choice comes in.
The fullness, just what you said, the metabolizing, right? The familiarity, the thoroughness of a person to their own events. And that's a lot, because that includes anguish, not just freedom from anguish, right? Because anguish is the disappointment in the self, and it's basically the incompleteness of how people feel their own reputations, or should be of their reputation. So that fullness, once it shows up, begins to me to give them a mobility and a freedom, because they've completed something. The search, the library, the research. Once that happens, their sense of not needing so much as they thought, or not being so immobilized by what they remembered, shows up naturally.
So there is a kind of freedom of choice in that space.
In that space.
Are there kinds of clients that pose a particular challenge for your approach?
Definitely. I would categorize it this way. If a client seems to need a lot of consolation, if a client is unwilling to look again, if a client is too hypersensitive to the emotional pain they bring, if a client has too much investiture in the story that seems to paralyze them, any of that would fairly well disqualify me from being able to do much with that kind of person.
Wow. How often do you find yourself going, I just don't think I can help you?
I have a nice reciprocal way of sitting with somebody and saying, even before we start, that this session, this first session, will be vigorous, will be as judgment-free as possible, because I want you to know how I work as fully as possible. And although I know in the professional community that's often questionable, because I'm not paying as much attention to thresholds and the calibration of somebody, that's true. I'm also, so to speak, laying it all out there that this is kind of the way I work most of the time, and that I'm open to being backed off, muted down a little bit, and kind of silenced a bit, as long as it's within this agreement and this contract to find the way, find the culprit, see where the error of thinking actually is, noticing the contributions that kind of saddled the horse, crippled the motion. Yes.
How would you apply this to, say, a Holocaust survivor?
I wouldn't. That would be so out of the... That to me, that example is such an example of wicked that I wouldn't apply it in any psychological way. It might be appropriate in a spiritual way, But mostly what I think we're doing as clinicians is operating in the field of psychology.
So how would you approach that survivor?
Well, I would just do a regular interview and want to know that the tyranny of memory operates in a certain way with them, get the best handle on it possible, and work with memory. It's really a problem with memory. If the person had amnesia for whatever reason, I guess you could argue, a person could argue it's happening on the inside with no visibility, right? Which is possible. But mostly we're working with clients who have visibility and memory. So it's still an issue of memory.
So you try to bubble wrap the memories?
I wouldn't bubble wrap it. I think it's just understanding a person's relationship to memory, obviously to justice, to loss, to the future. I mean, for me personally, I would want to know if they have some interest in carving out a future other than the way the past has forced them to be.
Are you influenced by Viktor Franco at all?
I love his work for sure. I mean, I live a privileged life. I'll probably never know the outrageous misappropriation of power that people have gone through in that war. I'll never know that in this lifetime. I'm grateful. I'm just like, wow, I don't have to go through all that. I might not be the best person at all to work with a person like that, unless they themselves wanted to step away from memory, step away from that hard grip of time.